You Will Die Here Tonight is an indie roguelike survival horror game developed by Spiral Bound Interactive and was released on the 31st of October 2023. And I imagine I went into this game like most people, expecting yet another rehash of the Resident Evil formula as all the familiar pieces were front and center. The spooky mansion, the bloodthirsty creatures, and the Special Forces team weigh in over their heads. Hell, even the uniforms the characters wear are virtually identical to the ones worn by Resident Evil's iconic STARS team. And you wouldn't be criticized for thinking that this game is going to be exactly that. Simple retreading of something we've seen done so many times over the years. All of this, however, is just a very clever disguise, as once the game has you sufficiently drawn in with the allure of a familiar premise, it then throws in a few unexpected twists and turns, amounting to a very refreshing experience. Of course, a lot of the classic survival horror elements remain, such as the Metroidvania-style gameplay, with the player spending a large portion of this game exploring the many rooms and vast halls of a sprawling mansion, hunting for keys and other valuable items, all the while fighting against hordes of undead cannibals. And what would a survival horror game be without the inclusion of elaborate puzzles? The puzzles in this game are pleasantly challenging enough that I was forced to fully engage my prefrontal cortex, which doesn't get as much exercise as it maybe should these days. Honestly, the puzzles in this game put Resident Evil 3's water sample puzzle to utter shame. All I can say is that I never would have expected knowing how to read sheet music would be a prerequisite skill needed to solve a video game puzzle. Beethoven, and to a lesser extreme my Year 8 music teacher, would have had this game on lockdown. In You Will Die Here Tonight, you play as the various members of a Spec Ops team known as Ares, as they're dispatched on a mission to capture a rogue pharmaceutical company employee who's now hiding within an abandoned manor house after stealing a valuable sample and killing their entire family. You know, the usual. It's admittedly a very basic yet intriguing setup that immediately presents the player with a few questions. What exactly did the employee take from this company that warranted a full-blown Spec Ops recovery mission? Why did they take the sample in the first place before killing their own family in cold blood? And lastly, what is significant about the employee's current hiding place, Brackenridge Hall? These questions generate anticipation for what we might find once we get to the manor and deepen the mystery surrounding the mission, allowing you to theorize and speculate about the employee's true intentions. And as expected, not long after the team infiltrates the hall, things start to take a turn for the worst as they're separated from each other after encountering some kind of supernatural entity. The player then gets to take control of each individual character as they're forced to fend for themselves against the undead, all the while trying to figure out what exactly is going on. And yes, I'm well aware that's literally the synopsis for the first Resident Evil. Difference being that here in this game you're able to play as each member of the team. We have the medic character, Lieutenant Ashley Kowalski, whose medical expertise can help her combine bioluminescent fungi and houseplants to create plastic containers with white crosses on them. We also have the red-blooded weapons expert, Lieutenant Eric Downs, who can upgrade our guns using nothing more but sheer determination, duct tape, and the necessary weapon parts to do so. We then have Shane Black's character from Predator mixed with Dennis Nedry from Jurassic Park, tech specialist Mike Kelly, who somehow manages not to be annoying and delivers some top-notch meta banter. And in fourth place we have our main character of sorts, Dr. Catherine Olsen. Looking at my notes, I've put main character in quotation marks because this character is only really the main character by virtue of the plot, and not because we spend most of the game playing as them. Without spoiling too much, Catherine is essentially the Wesker stand-in, although she looks more like Kim Wexler from Better Call Saul. Second to last is old-timer and demolitionist Sergeant Javier Rodriguez, whose only skill appears to be the ability to run as fast as all people fuck, which is within character now that I think of it. And finally we have the captain of the group chess grandmaster, Captain Charles Vincent, whose oddly specific skill set will come in handy. And I'm being deadly serious about that one.
Oh yeah, because that's where I keep my spare grenade launcher.
There's nothing inherently wrong with having a decent sized cast of characters to play as. The only issue I have with this, and I'll talk about it a bit more at the end, is that the game isn't really long enough for you to spend a good amount of time with each character. Unless you're proper shit at games like most video game journalists are, in which case you probably spent more than enough time with each character and you have my permission to safely disregard this point. Despite the characters feeling very samey during gameplay, the writing comes in clutch and gives each character just enough unique characterization to set them apart, even if they are pretty much a slightly more fleshed out group of character archetypes. I mean, look at Captain Vincent for Christ's sakes, he's the perfect 80s police chief archetype. All he's missing is a cigar and hypertension. For me, one of the game's highlights was seeing how each different character reacts to the same situation. For example, Kowalski's reaction to having to fight 3 haunted suits of armor is completely different to how Rodriguez would react to the situation. Both, however, are equally as cheesy. Stuff like this really helps a player get a sense for their personalities and makes the game worth playing a few times just to see how dialogue changes depending on who you're playing as. Having a decent amount of characterization gives the brutal and graphic deaths of the team a bit more weight and shock factor. For the most part, as the title of the game implies, you will die here tonight. And you will die here a lot tonight. In fact, this game might as well have been titled, You Must Die Here Tonight. And that's because death plays such a prominent mechanical role within the game, and in an unconventional turn, it can actually help progress the story further. Unlike in most games where dying is a minor inconvenience like running out of milk or missing the bus. And ironically, it's quite similar to how the Soulsborne games utilizes death as a kind of learning aid to help the player avoid previous mistakes and get good in the process. And by saying that, I'm not in any way suggesting that this game is the Dark Souls of the Resi-like games, because that would be fucking stupid. For example, if you get a puzzle wrong and in doing so you set off a trap that squishes you like a bug, next time round as a new character, you'll surely remember to avoid the steps you took previously to get that outcome. Certain clues and important information that can help solve puzzles like this will occasionally be stored in a notebook as a shared memory, which the player can access at any time with any character regardless of who discovered it in the first place. That's one of the biggest factors in exploration, a lot of trial and error. You may just have to die to figure out how to solve a puzzle or to test a theory. Granted, in doing so, it comes with a rather large consequence. That being, if you die, the character you are playing as will be perma-dead. In essence, you have 6 attempts per cycle to escape, and if you fail, you'll be sent back to the beginning of the game to start fresh. That is, unless you use this Bitcoin-looking thing to bribe the game into giving you an extra life, allowing you to revive all the dead characters and continue on within that cycle. Although these coins are few and far between, so tread carefully. That's pretty much this game's main gimmick, and I don't mind it as much as I thought I would. It also adds further to that sense of mystery, as the reason why our characters are stuck in a death loop isn't revealed until the very end, keeping you guessing throughout. Combat in this game is handled quite differently when compared to Resident Evil or Silent Hill, for instance, where you have to carefully position yourself away from enemies before holding one button to aim down the sights and then the other to fire your weapon. Here in this game, when we enter combat, we go from the top-down perspective to first person to deal with any threats. It's clearly been inspired by something like the House of the Dead franchise or Time Crisis. For me personally, it's a bit of a nostalgia wave and reminded me of the first-person segments from that Resident Evil Nintendo DS game. You can choose to manually enter the first-person combat mode provided enemies are within sight, otherwise you won't be able to. If you're grabbed by a zombie after they smash down a nearby door like you owe them rent or something, you'll be pulled into combat and will have to mash the left mouse button to break the grapple, otherwise you'll be bitten, incurring quite a bit of damage. Because of this, you'll have to make sure you put some distance between you and enemies before engaging. That's if you can. At the beginning of the game, we can enter a shooting range where Lieutenant Eric Downs will show us how guns work, as well as teach us the basics of CQC. While in combat, weapons can be aimed to tighten the crosshair, which makes the shot more accurate and more likely to deal a critical hit. Of course, this requires you to pace your shots, which enemies couldn't give 2 fucks about and will happily close the gap while you take your damn time. This usually results in a few well-placed shots before panic mag dumping enemies as they get too close for comfort. Bullet spread isn't a real issue when you can see the piss yellow of their undead eyes. The tutorial also covers breaking enemies' holds and melee combat if you happen to run out of bullets. You get a knife early on in the game, but it's only really good for the weaker enemies in the dungeon, as even the normal zombies upstairs in the hall are a force to be reckoned with. I can't really talk about the combat without bringing up the different weapons, as they'll ultimately determine how good of a time you have with the system. All the staple survival horror guns are here. We've got the handgun, the shotgun, magnum, grenade launcher and the submachine gun, all part of a good and well-balanced diet. The standouts for me have to be the shotgun and the submachine gun. Admittedly, I've got a bit of a soft spot for double-barrel shotguns. They just belong in games like this. That and this shotgun in particular sounds like it could put a hole in the mood. The submachine gun is also great at precision popping zombies' heads like zits, and that's never not fun. Also, the side mission you have to go on to get it is one of the game's highlights. With that said, I can definitely see how the combat system may turn some people off at first, as it can feel very clunky and cumbersome in some places. The best example of this is when you're in a boss fight. It's already pretty stressful, so having to mess around trying to figure out what buttons you need to press to heal yourself is a bit of a ball ache, in my experience at least. But once you get into the flow, it has a really satisfying rhythm to it. Got to the point where I enjoyed combat so much I was actively hunting down enemies to fight. Speaking of enemies, it's probably a good time to shed some light on the monsters lurking within Brackenridge Hall. This game doesn't have a lot of variety when it comes to enemies, granted. Besides zombies, the only other unique enemy types are bosses, Luckily, zombies come in a few different paint jobs and are visually and mechanically different enough to keep things fresh for the duration of the game. Firstly, we have the skeletal dungeon dweller zombies, aka Discord moderators. We then have the suave tailcoat zombies, which seem to be the most common. There are also axe and hammer wielding zombies that also like to throw said axes and hammers. And lastly, we have the most dangerous zombie type, the non-sexy Victorian maid zombies, who crawl along the floor at max speed like a demon just crawled up their ass. Zombies provide a fair bit of challenge in the earlier portion of the game, as they're able to soak up a good amount of your already limited ammunition supply, making running away from fights or avoiding them altogether viable options. Zombies will also actively chase the player through rooms and break down doors to get to them wherever they may be in the hall. Zombies also appear to be controlled by a parasite located in the brains, which acts as the weak spot. Funnily enough, it's quite a creative mix-up that the brain itself isn't the part of the zombie we necessarily need to destroy, but the parasite that's taken its place. Of course, as with most survival horror games, once you get a hold of that shotgun and the other powerful weapons, it's game over for the forces of evil. You Will Die Here Tonight is no exception to that rule. It's also a bit of a win-lose scenario, as naturally zombies become less of a threat when you're rolling around the house with a double-barreled Excalibur. On the other hand, however, it's very satisfying to make those heads explode. Zombies also provide an extra layer of challenge, as when you're bitten, there's a fairly good chance you will become infected, at which point a timer will appear in the top left corner and begin counting down from 5 minutes. That's your cue to hightail it back to the lab and grab some of that dirty Sprite. If you fail to make it back in time, you'll transform into a zombie and die, as opposed to staying human and living. It's a cool mechanic, sure, but if you get into the habit of getting bitten, it soon becomes very annoying. But at that point, it's honestly more of a you problem than anything else. What I will say is that trying to frantically remember the way back to the lab after straying too far from the beaten path is one hell of an anxiety-ridden journey. Although I do think maybe 5 minutes is a bit too long every time. They could have done with reducing the timer after a few consecutive bites, more or less ensuring your death. And again, the caveat to this mechanic is that the vaccine you can make is limited, so you have to weigh up whether or not the character you're playing as is really worth more than one dose. Exploration is another thing you need to get right in a game like this. It's arguably the most important feature, and if it's done badly, it can easily result in the player getting frustrated with their lack of progress, or even worse, you can lose their attention. It also needs to be done right, as outside of combat, it's what you'll spend a majority of the game doing. Luckily, the exploration in this game is a great experience for the most part. I, like many people, hate backtracking. I hated it in Resident Evil, and I'm glad there's very little of it here. That's mainly due to there not being a traditional inventory system, which I'm going to award a single gold star for. Instead, things like ammo and key items don't take up any kind of space, so the only time you'll need to backtrack is to swap weapons or restock your ammo. It was really fun and interesting to wander around Breckenridge Hall with absolutely no idea where I was going, but somehow, through my own patience and curiosity, I managed to slowly piece together what I needed to do to find the way forward, which is rewarding within itself. Being able to go around and interact with all the items around the hall helped create this idea that the area was once a proper lived-in place and not just some kind of simulation. The player is even rewarded by interacting with all the objects, which then incentivizes you to keep on doing it so you don't miss out on any hidden items or interesting dialogue. I almost forgot to mention that the player can peek through keyholes to see if there are enemies on the other side of the door. Not the greatest mechanic, since zombies will just smack the door down if they know you're there, but it's a nice addition nonetheless. Obviously, puzzles are a big part of the exploration, and it's safe to say puzzles in this game are pretty tough, especially for someone as big and smart as me is. It was actually quite a nice change from the chronic hand-holding of the more recent Resident Evil games, where the game will literally tell you what the fuck to do so you don't feel dumb or get self-conscious, because that does not help with player retention. So it's nice that this game actually calls you an idiot to your face, and the positive to this is that when you eventually do solve the puzzle, you feel a warm sense of accomplishment, like you've managed to successfully drive back home while pissed out your skull. Alternatively, getting most of the puzzles wrong results in the game penalising you by killing the player character in a multitude of ways, which include, but are not limited to, impalement, electrocution, exsanguination, pulverization, death by boulder, and death by theft of personal property, just to name a few. And because dying in this game has an actual tangible consequence, you better make sure next time round you get it right, or else. The game begins with Dr. Catherine Olsen stepping out of an elevator at Ares HQ, ready to disembark on a mission to detain a man called Jeffrey Monroe, a pharmaceutical worker wanted for stealing company property and, to a lesser degree, the murder of his entire family. Dr. Olsen is the newest member of the team, a neurobiologist whose expertise makes her uniquely equipped to assist on this mission. At the HQ, we're introduced to each member of the team in their natural habitats. We first meet Lieutenant Eric Downs, weapons specialist, who wears his disregard for weapon safety like a badge of honor. He gives us a quick rundown on the combat, which ends with us punching him in the face a couple of times.
Come over here and kiss me on my hot mouth.
After that, we're then free to leave and wander into the medical office where we meet Rebecca Chambers stand-in Lieutenant Ashley Kowalski. We can also go and say hello to the lab rat Henry, who Catherine decides to inspect by shoving her hand into the cage without wearing any kind of protection. Obviously, this results in Henry taking a massive chunk out of Catherine's finger. They really do just hand out doctorates these days, like Jehovah's Witnesses hand out leaflets. Luckily, Ashley has a first aid kit on standby showing us how the healing mechanic works. Heading into the main office, we can then meet tech specialist Mike Kelly, who's hard at work, pretending to be hard at work. Also in the room is Sergeant Javier Rodriguez, who doesn't say much apart from to stay away from his brass knuckles, which are currently perched nicely on his desk, almost as if they will be used to further the plot at some point down the line. We then meet the last member of the team, Captain Vincent Charles, before starting the mission and leave the HQ for the mysterious Brackenridge residence. Before that, I just want to mention how having the ability to walk around Ares HQ and speak to each of the team members in their own parts of the office is a very nice touch. Being able to interact with the team and get to know them, even if it is just briefly, is something that I feel was missing from the Resident Evil remake. Imagine how much more impactful the deaths of the STARS team would be if the game took a moment to cement them as more than just fodder to be killed without a second thought. It doesn't have to be a full-blown character profile detailing what their favourite food is or how when they were younger their favourite uncle got a bit too handsy at a Christmas party one time. It could just be something as simple as a few lines of dialogue that reflect who they are. The team finally arrives by helicopter and proceeds to raid the manor. As they do, a supernatural force flickers into existence, lighting the lamp on the table next to the stairs, which sends out a wave of energy, knocking everyone unconscious. Ashley then wakes up all alone with no one else in sight. She tries to contact the rest of the team by radio, but no one answers. Typical. At which point we can go and inspect the lamp and pick up a piece of paper that reads, "You will die here tonight. Anything you find may help the others," which in retrospect sums up the game pretty well. On the back of the note, a photo of Ares' team with the words, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." A not so subtle hint at the game's true plot. Immediately after reading the note, gunshots are heard from somewhere in the manor. A nearby door then opens, inciting us to go and investigate. Before running towards what can only be described as almost certain death, we can take a moment to inspect the lamp, which is essentially this game's version of a typewriter, where you can save your progress. And after exploring for a bit, we end up in a hallway where we can find the mutilated remains of our target, Jeffrey Monroe.
Well, we found him. It's a shame he's missing his internal organs.
He's quite clearly dead, but in the sense that he will more than likely get up and start walking around as soon as we leave the room. That kind of dead. Collecting the book nestled in Monroe's arms, the door ahead begins to rattle, before a zombie bursts through, determined to give Ashley a forbidden hickey. Putting the zombie down with relative ease, we can inspect the room from whence it came, at which point, in a very surprising and unexpected twist, Monroe reawakens and scoots off, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Checking the pool of blood, Ashley makes a fairly reasonable assumption that someone must have come in when she was in the other room and moved the body, which sounds a bit far-fetched, but not as far-fetched as the body reanimating and wandering off somewhere. Following the trail, Catherine gets in touch to tell us she's trapped in an underground lab where some kind of pathogen is being created, which explains the zombies. Eventually, we find the zombified Monroe, who we can either fight or run away from. Whatever the player decides to do, we still need to find a way down to the labs, which can be accessed through the library by completing a puzzle involving my least favourite pastimes: books, reading, and organisation. After finding the books, which isn't too much of a hardship, and slotting them into their respective places in the library, we can then go down to the secret entrance to the lab and meet up with Catherine, who promptly shoots Ashley in the face. Catherine is a double agent. Her real mission is to secure whatever Monroe had stolen and eliminate the Ares team. For all intents and purposes, she is the Albert Wesker stand-in for this game. Her mission is also pretty much identical to that of Wesker's in Resident Evil, and the reveal here in this game is pretty well done. It's got a fair amount of shock factor that completely caught me off guard. Not only is the player lulled into thinking Catherine is going to be the hero of this story, they then have her brutally murder the most naive team member after the player spent about 10 minutes playing as her. Upholding her end of the bargain and delivering the sample, Dr. Olsen demands payment. The director, however, decides to alter the deal and kill Catherine along with the rest of the team, showing her a picture of the team with all the faces crossed out as a not-so-subtle threat. Catherine decides to devise her own exfiltration and escape the manor, which goes really well as about 5 minutes later she is eaten alive by the undead. We then see some monitors that begin to count down. Reaching 0, we then end up back at the beginning of the game as Catherine steps out of the elevator once again. However, this time, something is a little off, as Catherine has vivid memories of the events that just transpired. Going around and speaking to all the other team members, they appear to have no memory of what happened, unlike Catherine. In the main office, Catherine's computer seems to be having some kind of malfunction this time round, and after inspecting it, we're given an error code telling us to find someone or something called Kirken. We can then start the mission up again, and it pretty much goes exactly like last time, except the player now takes control of Catherine instead of Ashley. Visiting the terminal, it introduces itself as Kirken. Kirken says that the original mission has changed and gives us a new mission, escape. Just as we get our new objective, the generator gives out, flooding the lab with darkness. Obviously, this means that we're going to have to venture down beneath the hall to where the steam-powered generator is and fix it. This time, when Catherine is attacked, we can actually survive and make some progress towards getting the power back on. To fix the generator, we have to make it through the manor's dungeon, which is currently inhabited by a couple dozen malnourished zombies. With only a few handgun bullets left to our name, we can instead find and use a combat knife to cut through them with relative ease. After dodging a very obviously placed murder boulder,
Not falling for this old trick.
we can then go on to solve a puzzle involving revolving Iron Maidens, which rewards us with the valve required to fix the generator and get the power back on. We can then go and speak to Kirken, who gives us a new mission: find a way to the back garden. This is our main objective and where the gameplay loop really begins, allowing us to explore the manor, solve puzzles and search for resources, as well as collect weapons to aid us in survival. And I just want to take a brief moment to talk about the design of the manor house itself, Brackenridge Hall. A seemingly abandoned 19th century manor house located somewhere in upstate New York that's design and layout very clearly takes a few pages out of the George Trevor Architecture Guidebook. More specifically, the pages that detail how to construct overly elaborate puzzles to keep everything locked away from the Spec Ops team that's here to investigate. Awfully specific, but it gets the job done. That's pretty much where the comparison ends between the Spencer Mansion and Brackenridge Hall, as the two have their own vastly different feel and atmosphere. The Spencer Mansion in my mind always felt like a cold dead labyrinth rotting from the inside, infested with reanimated corpses and monsters. Brackenridge Hall in comparison feels more like a haunted house filled with ghouls and ghosts. As soon as we enter the hall, it's made clear that there's some kind of supernatural entity at play here, appearing as both a vivid apparition and an unseeable force that blocks the doors and corrals the player towards certain death. As we explore the halls, we can hear the footsteps and laboured breathing of zombies in the adjacent rooms, the breathing so loud in fact it almost sounds like Brackenridge Hall itself is a living, breathing organism, given life by the supernatural force that lives within it. All of what I just said is ultimately rendered BS by the big plot twist, but it looked good on paper and made me sound super smart, so I decided to keep it in. After searching around the manor, we eventually find the servant's key, and after a very memorable and creepy sequence involving a music player that gets stuck on a loop and keeps repeating the word die over and over again because Screw's being subtle, we're jumped by a zombie maid wearing a mask, which is meant to be a mini-boss but goes down pretty easy. Using the key, we can eventually gain access to the back garden where the helicopter is parked. However, a ghostly apparition that looks eerily similar to the team's original target Jeffrey Monroe has the helicopter key. The key we need to make the helicopter do the thing it was designed to do. Chasing after the ghost, it phases through the gate like the T-1000. As the ghostly Monroe disappears into the distance, the three night statues in front of us holding plates light on fire one by one. Unable to follow due to being bound to a physical body and not an ethereal one, we must return back to Kirken for some help. As we traverse back through the hall to the lab, it would appear that the night statues that previously adorned the main hall have got up and vanished. I was kind of expecting something like this to happen with the 3 corresponding statues outside lighting up, but it was still kind of eerie to see the suits missing without any sign of where they might have gone. They'll pop up soon for a boss fight, but until then it's back to Kirkin, who says that we'll have to brave the attic if we wish to get the key to the gate. The terminal doesn't say much for a computer, but it does tell us to prepare for major combat once we make it to the 3rd floor. If you happen to be playing as tech specialist / turbo virgin Mike Kelly, you will receive a secondary objective from Kirkin to infiltrate the network and disable some kind of firewall. Kirkin then says it will disable all the cameras around the manor, but only for 5 minutes. This is how long we have to complete the mission, as we have to retrieve an arrow and use it to gain access to the facility underneath the atrium. You know, the usual stuff. This side mission borrows a few elements from the Resident Evil remake, such as pushing a statue down into the dinner hall and placing an arrow alongside a cherub to gain access to the secret area. Of course, not everything goes to plan, as pushing the statue down below breaks the arrow, so we have to traipse back to Kirkin to fix it for us before finally heading towards the atrium. This is probably a very good moment to bring up how the developers managed to skillfully inject a tolerable amount of self-aware meta-humor into the game without it getting to the point where it's overbearing or eye-rolling. Getting this kind of humor right is understandably a very fine line to toe, but thankfully, the writers managed to hit the nail on the head when it comes to the delivery. This side mission is a perfect example of this, as the player makes the way beneath the cherub statue to complete the mission by deactivating the firewall. After doing so, Kelly finds his own corpse grasping a submachine gun. Naturally, my first thoughts were, how exactly did he end up down here, and how did he die? Will we ever find out? Then, a brief moment later, the cameras suddenly turn back on and a poisonous gas is released into the room which suffocates Kelly to death.
Okay. Right, yeah. I see what you did there. Very, very clever game. Very clever.
Honestly, black comedy really tickles my pickle, so to see it executed so well here was a genuine surprise, but a welcome one to be sure. Also, the fact that Kelly agreed to go on this mission after falsely believing that Kirkin had fallen in love with him after exchanging like 3 sentences is fucking hilarious and very true to his character. Completing the side quest will award the player with a pretty powerful submachine gun. The mission also has ramifications for the ending, but I'll get into that as and when. After finding the 2 brooches belonging to the very dead wife and very dead child of the manor's original owner, we can use them to open up the manor's 3rd floor, which is covered in spiders' webs and egg sacs, hinting at what Kirkin warned us about. With the gate key in sight, we're then attacked by a giant spider. Sorry, I meant to say massive spider, because you really couldn't have a Resi-like game without the inclusion of a giant creature that was formerly a normal-sized creature. The spider boss fight on the 3rd floor was, for me at least, the most challenging encounter in the entire game. Not only is this a 3-stage boss fight, its difficulty spike is way sharper than all of the prior encounters leading up to it, resulting in a lot of dying, with each character's life spent chipping away at the monster before ultimately succumbing to it. The game is at least nice enough to keep a tally of all your previous attempts, in the shape of cocoon bodies strewn around the boss arena, like a massive middle finger to the player for dying so much. In fact, the spider boss fight was shaping up to be so much of a pain in my ass that I decided to rethink my entire life choices and venture back into the mansion, to see if I could find anything to help with squashing the BFS. And after wandering around trying to tie up any loose ends, I did, in the form of a grenade launcher hidden within a piano. With the grenade launcher, I was then able to march right back upstairs and kill the spider boss with relative ease, using my newfound firepower in tandem to squash the overgrown pest.
It took fucking everyone to kill that spider.
It's almost like this boss was designed to be ruthless on purpose, forcing the player to retreat back into the manor's lower floors to make sure they've collected everything to be able to stand a chance against it. In addition to the grenade launcher, you can also find a shield chained to a knight on the 2nd floor. To crack the padlock combo, the player needs to combine 2 different memories, one being the number sequence from the pool balls and the other being the chess piece configuration that's got the captain stumped. Using these, we can figure out which numbers are connected to which chess pieces, giving us the correct combination to remove the padlock and retrieve the shield. The hardest part about this puzzle was finding the solution online.
Oh, I definitely didn't cheat for this, by the way.
Really had to swallow my pride for that one. Taking the shield, the knight that was holding it springs to life and attacks. Understandably, he's a bit pissed we've decided to steal his property. And I can see why the knight was so desperate to get his beloved shield back, as in contrast to how shields are typically used in video games to either block or redirect incoming attacks, this shield is instead used more as a powerful offensive weapon. It can be used to stun lock enemies if your time your hits right, allowing you to swap weapons or get a few more shield strikes in. Being able to both stagger and bash zombies' skulls in makes the shield a very strong utility weapon and borderline broken. It's also another prime example of the player being rewarded for exploration. After defeating the spider and doing a final sweep of the manor, collecting all there is to collect, we can grab the gate key and head outside to finally confront the ghostly figure. Before that, however, we're going to have to brave a hedge maze that is filled to the brim with shuffling corpses. At this point, those zombies themselves don't even provide the slightest bit of challenge, and is more so the game letting the player go buck wild with all the cool toys they've collected along the way. And you better make the most of it, as after this encounter, you can kiss those weapons goodbye. Making it through the maze and using both of the levers to open the gate to where the master of the manor is, we can step forward and challenge him for the only ticket out of here: the helicopter key. Him and the rest of his very dead family then vanish into thin air upon approach. If the three knights surrounding us look familiar, that's because they are the very same ones that used to be in the main hall, before they took a leisurely stroll out to the garden for a bit of fresh air. The knights are then struck by lightning as they reanimate. Whoever we're playing as drops a quirky one-liner specific to their character before we are thrust into a boss fight. Although it may look intimidating being surrounded by three hulking knights hell-bent on our destruction, it is a laughably easy encounter that pales in comparison to the previous spider boss. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, the player now has access to all of the weapons available to them at this point in the game, as well as all the weapon upgrades. One upgrade for the shotgun in particular completely trivializes this fight. During exploration, the player can find weapon upgrade boxes which allow us to tune up our weapons, increasing their stats. Only Lieutenant Eric Downs has the ability to upgrade weapons, so even though he is the most insufferable character in the entire game, I was forced to play as him at least once or twice. Eventually, we can find an upgrade which gives us the option of turning the shotgun into a sawn-off or giving it a rifle barrel. The first option reduces range and increases spread, which is honestly just useless because it makes the weapon worse than the base version. The second option, however, increases range at the cost of spread and, in essence, turns the shotgun into a sniper rifle that does massive critical damage. Instead of explaining how busted the upgrade is, I'll just let this clip roll. As you can see, it pretty much breaks the fight, and it's not helped by the mechanical structure of the encounter either, which is the second reason why this fight is piss easy. At the start of the encounter, one of the knights will begin to move slowly towards the player. Once you've dealt enough damage, the first knight will freeze and the second will begin to move. This cycle pretty much repeats over and over until all of the knights have been vanquished, so you're not at any point being attacked by more than one knight. It's a shame that this fight doesn't live up to its potential. If all three knights slowly approach the player at once and attack strategically, forcing us to think quickly and manage the fight, it would have been a far more interesting and enjoyable encounter. The foundations for that kind of gameplay are right there, so it's surprising that the devs opted for the triple threat setup without fully utilizing it. With the knights defeated, we are then given the helicopter key by the ghosts. We can then head to the helicopter and finally escape the mansion. But not without getting completely cabin in the woods by a giant fishbowl-like structure keeping anyone from escaping. This artwork makes a hell of a lot more sense in hindsight. It's revealed that the manor house is located in some kind of massive industrial testing facility, complete with glowing danger lights and a big old warning siren. The cycle then begins anew as Catherine once again exits the lift at Ares HQ. This time, however, she will have full knowledge of the attempted escape and subsequent helicopter crash, even if she wasn't the character that died in the explosion. She'll even comment on the fact that the memory isn't hers. We're then prompted to check Catherine's computer in the main office, where we are contacted by Kirkin. Catherine asks how Kirkin, who only seemed to be able to contact us through the terminal in the Manor's lab, can now speak to us here at the HQ. Kirkin explains that because Kelly disabled the firewall during his side mission, it is now free to give us the final mission, True Escape. Kirkin finally spills that family-sized tin of beans and reveals to us that we have, in fact, been trapped inside a simulation this entire time. Anyway, Kirkin tells us that we need to create a distraction, stealing the sergeant's knuckle dusters before moving on to steal the armory keys. To steal the keys, we have to distract the captain with the solution to a chess problem. We can find the solution back in the Manor's lab, and if you didn't find it before getting to this point, you'll have to go back and complete the cycle again. Ouch. With the captain fully distracted like he's a henchman checking a suspicious floor grid, we can rush towards the armory. But before we can enter it, we have to deal with Lieutenant Eric Downs, who won't let us enter the armory while he's conscious. To succeed, we need to make him unconscious by using the knuckle dusters to knock him out. With that tosser out the way, we can enter the armory and grab the grenade launcher with enough ammo to last us until the credits roll, which is a roundabout way of saying that it's unlimited. The director then becomes aware of Catherine's deviating from the script and releases a poisonous gas into the room, which doesn't seem to bother Catherine in the slightest. The gas turns the rest of the team into zombies, but doesn't affect Catherine for some reason. I have no idea why she wasn't immediately turned into a zombie by the gas, and neither did the writers, as we don't get a full explanation other than Kirkin somehow planned for this as part of a contingency. I understand that it's not really meant to make sense, but make it make sense. Like I said, the gas turns everyone into zombies, which isn't an issue due to now having a grenade launcher with infinite ammo. After making it back through the HQ, slaying zombified teammates left, right and centre, we make it to the captain's office where Catherine promptly quits Ares. This action completely breaks the simulation and allows us to access these secret underground labs hidden beneath the HQ. Because where else would the final act take place? Whilst in the facility, we can collect a few documents that help explain what has been going on throughout the course of the game. It's revealed that Ares is actually a manufacturer of bioweapons with military applications, and that the Ares team are no more than clones mass-produced to test the capabilities of said bioweapons, being sent like lambs to the slaughter over and over again, like that nonsensical plot point from the nonsensical Resident Evil films. Essentially, I think the bad guy's motivation boils down to Big Shadow Company produce obedient undead super soldiers that are borderline unkillable to turn a profit. If that's an accurate summary, this game has successfully implemented one of the most overused tropes out there. It's also revealed that Kirkin is actually an AI responsible for running the experiments, and has for some reason gone rogue and decided to turn the whole thing upside down, using Catherine as a catalyst. As to why Kirkin decided to rebel and do its own thing, who knows? Venturing deeper into the facility, we see a shadowy figure who we can presume is the director running away from us across the rafters hanging above Ares' office, like it's the set of a TV show or something to that effect. After dodging a few lasers and killing our way through a bunch of Monroe clones, Monroe clearly being some kind of mass-produced nerd who works for Ares behind the scenes, we enter a room filled with clones of Catherine, and right in the middle, a giant tank containing a mutant, tyrant-like clone. At this point, the facility begins to collapse, which only means one thing: it's time for a boss fight. The tank begins to empty and the abomination is released. Catherine X then jumps down to attack, not to be confused with Mr. or Jason. Having an infinite ammo grenade launcher, however, makes this fight far too easy, even with Catherine X pulling the old Nemesis grenade dodge maneuver. Shooting the ground next to her inflicts enough splash damage to end the fight shortly after it begins. If that fight looked a bit too easy, you're absolutely right. Catherine X reappears once again after we enter a freight elevator in pursuit of the director, and the second round is just as easy as the first, if not easier. You can just sit back and spam grenades at her feet, essentially stun locking her until we can get some direct hits in. Defeated once again, Catherine X takes takes a tumble over the railing and falls to her apparent death. Reaching the top, we can finally confront the director face to face. Catherine then gets the shock of her life as the director is revealed to be none other than Catherine herself. The original Catherine, that is, or at least I think that's what they were implying by having them look virtually identical, albeit the real Catherine has a quirky supervillain scar running across her eye. In addition to this identifying feature, she also wears the colour red, and if my GCSE in English literature taught me anything, that means she is one truly dangerous lady indeed. That is, until she is unceremoniously crushed by a falling supply crate courtesy of Kirkin. Before being pancaked, the original Catherine reveals she is not in fact the director and hints at some kind of coming extinction event, and the research being done here was in part to protect humanity from that. At least I think that's what they meant by this. We don't actually get any definite explanation, so it's really just speculation at this point. She also makes reference to the Catherine clones not being able to have their memories wiped like the others, which explains why Catherine could remember things like the helicopter crash, but doesn't explain how or why Kirkin influenced this. Inspecting the crate so generously gifted by Kirkin, we find a laser gun, exactly what the non-mutant, non-pancaked Catherine would need to defeat the non-human, non-pancaked Catherine X. And sure enough, after a couple blasts of the laser gun, the Tyrant is destroyed once and for all. Catherine then takes another lift up to where the actual director is, who I suppose is implied to be none other than the player themselves, which, come to think of it, makes a little bit of sense considering that we, the player, have been the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes this entire time. Catherine then promptly executes the director before the game comes to an abrupt end. It's a cool little fourth wall break that admittedly left me asking, what the fuck just happened? You Will Die Here Tonight provides a very unique take on the survival horror genre, and it's one that is guaranteed to challenge all of your preconceived notions of what to expect from a Resident Evil inspired horror game. It's a game that wastes no time at all communicating to the player that it will be a very different experience with a shocking twist that gets you asking a whole lot of questions, some of which are answered, but most of them will forever remain a mystery. And to be quite honest, I was never that interested enough in the story to care that much anyway. Not that the story You Will Die Here Tonight tells is uninteresting, it's more so the fact it gets a bit convoluted and tries to do way too much with too little time. The game certainly has a lot of potential in its storytelling. A few of the plot points were very well done, and the initial twist where Catherine is revealed to be a traitor really did take me by surprise. Twists like the mansion being part of a simulation and the clones on the other hand, I'm not too fond of. I can see that the devs wanted to subvert our expectations as much as possible, but in my opinion it just drains any intrigue I had out of Brackenridge Hall or the Monroe subplot that's set up at the start. And looking back, I suppose that's kind of the point. It's not meant to go the way you want or expect it to. That doesn't mean it gets a free pass though, as arguably the initial mystery surrounding the hall, the zombies and the supernatural elements, for me at least, was way more interesting than the whole simulation thing. Despite my gripes with the story beats, it's a very welcome change that this game decided to deviate from the beaten path and try something a little different. That, and it's just a really fun game in general. A lot of the credit for that has to go to the gameplay. The blending of different genres makes for a really interesting formula that keeps you engaged for a majority of the playtime. The combat, although arguably very clunky and rough in some places at first, ended up being one of the more satisfying elements to the gameplay. Once I got to grips with how it handles and collected all the weapons, I was genuinely aching for a fight, as each encounter left me craving more bloodshed and violence. It's just a damn shame the game ends not too long after you max out your arsenal. By the time we reach the third floor and fight against the giant spider, the game is more or less in its final throes. All that's left to do is fight through the maze and beat the stupidly easy triple boss fight, before we end up back at the HQ for a hefty helping of semi-cohesive exposition and some completely trivialized shooting gallery sequences. Nowhere near as exciting or engaging as the first couple of hours of gameplay prior to it. Because of this, the player doesn't get enough time to fully enjoy playing around with said arsenal, even if you do find all the weapons at the earliest opportunity. This is ultimately my biggest gripe with the game. It doesn't last long enough. You Will Die Here Tonight retails for about 16 GBP, which is roughly $20 US. Granted, it's not the most expensive indie game out there, but it's not exactly what I'd call cheap, especially when we consider that this game has a shorter playtime of roughly 5 hours. Normally, this is perfectly acceptable, as these kinds of games have a larger focus on replayability as a way to justify the price tag and keep the player engaged. You Will Die Here Tonight, unfortunately, does not have enough replayability or extras outside the main story to really justify that kind of asking price.
It's a very one and done kind of deal. Once you've scoured the hole for all the items and added all the guns to your arsenal, there isn't really much point coming back for a second playthrough. In addition to this, and to my surprise, there aren't multiple endings to chase either, unless you count going round and round in an endless loop until you stumble upon the true ending, which isn't necessarily a hard thing to achieve. All you need to do is complete the game's only side mission. This game also doesn't have any difficulty options, which is a violently distraught shame since I'm a glutton for punishment and would have happily suffered through this game with the difficulty cranked up, just to give me another reason to play through it again. Despite the game lacking content, what we do get is very good. So good in fact it becomes a downright shame that the game doesn't have anything else to offer, because I would happily let this game suck up a few more hours of my time. If it wanted to suck them, that is. With all that said and done, I still managed to squeeze 3 playthroughs out at nearly 10 hours in total and had a good time while doing it. So it's really up to you as an individual as to whether or not you're willing to spend 16 quid on what could be a few fun hours. Alternatively, with that money you could buy a pack of Marlboro Reds and a can of Coke. The choice is yours. Jokes aside, even though this game is shorter than I would have liked, it is an incredibly fine-tuned and polished experience for what it is. The genre-blending combat for me was satisfying and unique. The exploration was intriguing and didn't really feel like a chore. The writing, no matter how dumb and campy, managed to get a few laughs out of me here and there, so it gets a pass in my book. And the weird and disjointed plot was forgivable due to how well everything else I've just listed was executed. And for those reasons, You Will Die Here Tonight has certainly raised the bar for any of those Resident Evil-inspired indie games that pop up on Steam every once in a while. I really did enjoy my time with this game. There are glimmers of some really good ideas here that just need a little more development and fine-tuning. If you're ever in the market for a survival horror game in the same vein as Resident Evil with some really unique combat mechanics, retro-style exploration and puzzle solving, coupled with some really beautiful art direction while also providing some refreshing twists and turns, look no further than You Will Die Here Tonight.